Excellent.
All right. So let it be written, so let it be done. This is Tabletop Terrors, and I am joined here with Kiel and Lloyd, and we're going to be talking about game design. We're going to be talking about Blood and Ink, a game I know nothing about. That's by design. We're specifically going to be asking them some questions about the game. One of the best ways to make sure that the concept in your head is as clear as you want it to be is showing it to someone who has no frame of reference. That's what this is. So, Blood and Ink, cool name. What is it?
It is a powered by the apocalypse system that we're making to make it easier to run the games that I run anyway, which is games that are gritty and scary in terms of combat, but also focus on empire building and like intrigue in a way that D&D doesn't usually excel at. Yeah, that's probably it.
That's great.
Yeah.
Keel, is there anything you want to add to that?
So yeah, I'd say it's definitely powered by, strongly inspired by the apocalypse. So the obviously apocalypse world was the original one, and for people that don't know, there's this sort of sub genre now, I suppose, this whole movement in the RPG space of very narrative focused games, and that's where this one's coming from. And we're also taking inspiration from a few other games like Blades in the Dark, Monster Hearts, which Monster Hearts is a powered by the apocalypse game in itself, and a few other places as well.
Killer. I'm roughly familiar. I've never played a Powered by the Apocalypse game, but I understand how it works in terms of, and so if you're watching this and you don't really have a frame of reference on that, it is a game where the rules give you moves that you can perform. So it's very narrative, but there are codified things that you can do. In the same way, it's one of the only games I've ever seen where the game master has a set of rules also. And so the game master can also do moves. And so it is very much a back and forth. It's not like, well, I want to do this, and then you make up what that is. It's, okay, that sounds a lot like this move, so go ahead and do that. Right,
it's like the fiction declares when you do the thing. So you're just running through the fiction, and then when there's a trigger, like, oh, that's this move, and then you roll it.
Yep.
So it's not like I want to do my ability that lets me do this. It's I'm doing this thing that I can do, and now that sounds like the move, and so I'll do it.
Right. And so I think it's a cool concept. I've never played. I have seen it played, and so it's very fluid. Like, from what I saw, there's not like, oh, now this person moves here. Okay, now you do this. It's sort of this living, like, things happen at the same time, and it's about adjudicating fairly and so on. So with that said, so giving that sort of framework of like, okay, this is what a Powered by the Apocalypse game is, I'm assuming your moves are like literally political intrigue moves. Like, this is a backstab move, and this is a parlay or sycophant, or how did you do that? What made you decide what moves to include?
You want to go?
Yeah, we have. We both unmuted at the same time. Yeah, we have them grouped by. We sort of approached it from a design perspective as what the gameplay will look like, and it's very sort of faction focused. So it could be like a noble house, it could be like a Viking reaving crew of a longship, things like that.
It could be a trading company, it could be a mercenary company. Like, it's not limited to, it's any sort of faction that has a structure where there's a person in charge. That's the important part of it. But it's like any sort of faction that you can think of, you can make with it.
That's great.
Exactly, yeah. And the idea is that everything is done through a personal lens. So it's very character focused. So where the rubber meets the road, as I say ad nauseum, is where you make these schemes. We have these intrigue moves, I think is the placeholder name at the moment, or where there's literally schemes is the sort of mechanized part of the game, where it's this guided process to come up with your schemes. And one of the pillars of the game is, or the principles is, encouraging meta discussions. And so there's moves which help guide you through making these schemes, and then there's moves where someone has to make those things happen. So if a scheme is like an assassination scheme, you will plot out as a group, like you'll literally hold your small council meeting or whatever it might be, and talk, sort of flitting between meta and in-character discussion as however suits best for your group. And then there's literally like a scheme sheet where you can record down, make progress clocks, and sort of plan out the steps to complete that scheme. And then each of those things has to be done by a character, basically, whether it's an NPC that you delegate that to, or one of the actual PCs. But that was a really important focus, was having it through the lens of the people involved, and making it personal. And that's a big part of it.
Yeah.
One of the things I noticed in playing in games is that like my brain's really good at that and keeping in it 30 NPCs and their motivations.
Yeah.
So it's easy for me when I'm playing to like take a step back and look at the whole situation of a game and make a plan of how we will succeed as players and as characters in the tasks that we want to do. That's really difficult for like a lot of people, most people probably. And it really occurred to me when we were playing Spire game, where there was an episode where myself and Jeff started talking in schemes. We're like, okay, well, this guy relates to this person, and then this, if we, mess with this house, that'll trigger this thing over here. And like literally that meme of the guy with the red string from It's Always Sunny, right? Like we have this plan, and I could just see like Kiel and Chad's faces like, what? Like just boom, and that's like not in any way their fault. That's just a case of that, like some people's brains are good at keeping track of that many NPCs and that many threads, and some people aren't. And so the intent was to make it possible and easy for anyone to sort of be a schemer and do intrigue. Yeah,
and I'm not good at that. I think I'm better at sort of narrative story beats and like, that's actually sometimes where my fiction falls off the rails, is because it's not motivated. It's sometimes too rule of cool, where it doesn't line up with the motivations that it should, but it's like, but that's cool if it happens. I think we see this a lot in like, some J.J. Abrams stuff, where he's like, yeah, but it's cool. I can lean more to that camp. So let me just say real quick, if you're interested in this game, one of the places that you're going to be able to see this game is on Kiel's Patreon. It is patreon.com/runrightplay, RUNWRITEPLAY. I am a patron. It is worth it. And so we're talking about this here because we actually have a Patreon here on Tabletop Terrors that specifically focuses on game design, breaking things down. And so that's why we're talking about it publicly here. If you're into that sort of thing, you can check out ours as well. So this game is about intrigue. And so is it going to have a setting that you are going to put into it, or is it going to be something where the player is and the GM is required to sort of come to the table with their own Game of Thrones kind of thing?
So the intent is that you can use it in Westeros for sure, play Game of Thrones, but also that you can use it in Iscloft or in like any sort of setting that is a bit more granular, I guess, and that lends itself towards plotting and combat that is very lethal. Those are the two things that you kind of need to tick in order for this to work for you.
Okay.
Combat, the intent there is that like, if you get into a fight, you should have planned it. And if you haven't planned it, then you're in big trouble. Like if you're accidentally in a combat, then you are in big trouble. You've probably made series of mistakes and you've ended up in a situation where you are likely to die.
Wow. Yeah, that's the kind of thing that I always want to do, but I can never do. Exactly as you say. So this framework, can you talk me through how this framework enforces that or rewards that sort of thinking? Are there mechanics where it'll be more deadly for me if I haven't planned on it?
Yep. So we have a what is it called? Engage the enemy or something.
One of the moves,
which is like when you start combat, you look at the situation, and so there's like a list of things. So, are you surprising the enemy, or are you surprised? Do you have the advantage of the terrain, or does the enemy? And for each point, basically, that you or the bad guys have, you get this meta currency, which is called momentum at the moment, but we're not sure about that yet. which sort of you can spend in combat to do things, power your moves and increase your effectiveness. So the more prepared you are for a fight, the better it's going to go. And the less prepared you are, arguably the more prepared the enemy is. So they'll have more momentum and they'll probably be able to do more stuff quicker. And so it's sort of swinging in that way deliberately. Like you should be prepared for combat. You should be planning this stuff out. And if you are like ambushed by the baddies, it's not like you're going to be at maximum effectiveness the way you are in D&D, because it doesn't matter how a combat starts in D&D. You're equally effective until you have no hit points, right? Like, doesn't actually make a difference. So this way, it rewards careful planning and rewards your schemes sort of moving in this direction, and it rewards you setting up a battlefield and taking the time to scout the enemy and stuff like that. Like all that stuff based on this little engage the enemy like move.
I like it.
Makes a big difference.
Yeah, I think
and
that's
then
really
in terms cool. Another angle on the deadliness and that feeling of you only really want to be in a fight if you've planned it and if you feel like you're going to win, is that PCs are, well, just characters in general are, I don't know if I'd say squishy, but you have wounds is instead of HP, so it's more or less HP, but you have very few hit points. You have few amount of wounds that you can take, and each wound that you take represents the enemy getting past your guard and past all of the situations going on in combat. So when you take a wound, that is an actual wound, which you write down narratively and mechanically, like exactly what that wound is. So shoulder stabbed or like gut wound or whatever it is. So each wound is something specific that can then potentially linger. So that's another way that it feels you want to avoid getting stabbed, just as you do in real life, because one stab can mess you up.
Yeah. That's another really important thing. And so I like so far what I'm hearing, where the gravity of everything immediately in the rules is different. And that, you know, we just did a video on this channel about like, why do we kill everything in D&D? And it's because the rules are written toward that. And Jeff made a really good point where it's like 2/3 or more of what you have that you prepare for your character is how to kill stuff or manipulate things that you want to. And it's like, so this is a really cool lens to look through, where one of the things that I will never forget, and it was just a one-off, we played a game in Iskloft, and I got this like terrible like pelvic wound, like this groin wound or something. And I remember like the battle was over and all that stuff, and I think my character died like 12 weeks later.
Yeah.
Just narratively, because I was stabbed. And I thought, man, that really kind of stuck with me. So having a game that focuses around that, I think you're going to have success with the tone you're trying to strike. So let me ask you this then. With this sort of dark, like you say, dangerous sort of play, are you going to give any kind of explicit warning, like in the rules? Because this is another thing we've been talking about a lot, is so many game books for a long time have shied away from the designer just coming right out and telling you what their intent is. And so I did a lot of that in A Dead Man's Guide to Dragongrin. Like, this section is for this exact thing. So are you going to say, this game is for intrigue, and you need to think about it that way if you're going to enjoy it?
Yep. We've got a pretty big section on like I guess I would always call them pillars of like a game, but like, and that's like a real meta discussion of like, hey, listen, this is what the game's about. You should be talking out of character sometimes, because you have to plan things. Like, combat's meant to be dangerous or a last resort, like things like that. And
you should split the party, because everyone has their own specialties and things like that.
I love it. So you should split the party.
Yes.
Right, everyone needs to be doing their own thing in their own place.
Because not everyone's a warrior, right? So some, like, you can be a shield, which is the warrior class, or calling, as we're calling them. So you could be a warrior if you like, but you don't have to be. You could also be like a priest, or you could be like an accountant, like legitimately, like the Quill, whose job it is to like be the steward of the faction and take care of the finances and run the place. if that person's in a fight, they're dead. They don't have any combat training.
Right.
Like they shouldn't be in the combat. So they shouldn't even go. They should be like running the intrigues and planning the things and managing the stuff. And like, that's for some people sounds super boring, but for like Nico or for myself, that's a dream character where like I don't have to get into combat and risk my life, and I can actually just like sit there and do the planning. Amazing. Like I love that, you know? And so I think there's enough people like that who will enjoy that element, you know?
That is something really neat that I've never seen before, is that you're all playing the same game in different places.
Right.
Like one way that I'll just say one way that we facilitate that happening is because you're part of a faction and part of when you first sit down to play the game, whether it's in session 0 or just at the start of your first session, there's this guided process again to flesh out your faction and who's in it. Not only just for which PCs you're playing, but for who is the Master of Whispers, for example, who is the steward of the castle and everything like that. And so, you can lay it out as a hierarchy. And so you already have these NPCs with their own sort of characteristics they're people. That's the important part of this, is that a faction is made up of its people. You're playing some as player characters, but all the others are people as well.
That's great.
And it encourages a bit of depth there. And so if only one of the characters, so say you've got a group of PCs where 3 of them are schemers and one of them is like the knight or whatever, then when the knight goes to do the battle that the schemers have helped plan, you know,
so good.
Then the 3 players who are playing the schemer characters during that fight, they're not just sitting there not playing. They can take control of one of the other members of the faction who's usually an NPC, you know? So it's designed that way as well, so that they still get to enjoy the action of the battle that they've planned, you know, and see the alliance that they secured, like right up as the cavalry, right at the right moment. And they're there I'm trying to keep it PG-13. In the poop.
In the thick of it.
As they hear the thundering cavalry charge, like from the alliance from the Erie come riding up, you know.
And I think so. One of the things that's really cool about that is that in a game like Dungeons and Dragons, or many others that are similar, the person who goes off to scheme is a side thing that stops the game. And this is something that is such a cool thing, where I can feel like Littlefinger. When I go off and do my thing, it actually saves the shield's life. Like, that is such a cool distinction that I've never seen before. So can you talk me through do you have some more classes? So it's the shield, what'd you call them? The Master of Whispers. Was that a class?
So we've got the shield, which is any sort of heavy warrior. So a Huskarl, a knight, a space marine, whatever, right? That's the shield. We've got the cloak, which is someone who'll shank you when you're not looking.
Nice.
A roguey type, but also like a swashbuckler, also a pirate, you know.
Maybe a rangery type as well. Yeah.
Yep. And we have the helm, which is the commander who is shouting orders and moving people around and on the battlefield in the thick of it, giving orders and commanding.
That's cool.
And then those are the 3 combat callings. And then there are 3 others. We've got the quill, which is somebody who's mostly using a quill to wield power. So that's a Master of Whispers. That's Littlefinger. That's Varys. That's schemers like that. We've got the Candle, which is someone who's religiously inclined.
I like these names. These are really good names, guys.
Whether that's a like drowned priest or a red priest or a priest of ill matter or whatever.
Or a Galder or a...
Yes, exactly.
Gothi. Yep.
And then we have the coin, which is a merchant of some kind. Someone who excels at making deals and getting the better of others when they're making those deals. So expert negotiator, managing finances, that kind of thing. So you've got...
That's so cool.
3 fighty boys and 3 schemy humans.
Schemy ladies. So I love the naming conventions. Those adds so much for me. You know, like I think it's very underestimated, the naming things, and how that changes the tone so drastically. So as an example, I'm working on a game called Super Heroic, and I'm basically throwing out everything and only adding what I need. And just even the fact of calling things like hit points or dealing damage, like you're not dealing anything. That's not how the game works. And so by naming something a quill, I immediately feel like that's way different than just some of the OSR stuff or even the Powered by Apocalypse stuff that is a sort of a D&D clone in a different system. It gets me in a different mindset because I'm not bringing in all my baggage of Druid. You know, because I'm going to assume more about what that is than what it isn't, and you're going to have to work to teach me what's different about yours. But you change the name, and all of a sudden I'm a blank slate. So that's a design tip. Just don't make the names too outlandish or weird so that I can't remember all of them, and I'm like, who's the Gleeble Brock?
Right.
So these are really cool thematic names, and I'm digging them.
Yeah, I think it was important, I mean, to sort of give the impression of what the calling does by using a tool that they use the most, right? So the quill, the pen, like is mightier than the sword literally in many instances in these sort of scheming games. Like you can't win a war on your own by being a rad warrior, but you can by signing the right documents.
Right.
The coin, like that is a mighty weapon as well in these games, like with the right coins in the right hands and the correct handshakes, you know, you can do a lot of conquering without spilling a drop of blood.
That's so cool.
So we want to give the impression that like those are the weapons that they use, those are the tools that they use to also contribute to the power of the faction, you know.
I love it. Yeah. So what stage of design are you in now? Are you playtesting? Are you stuck on something? Like what's the next order of business?
So we're finished with the combat. We tested that 3 times. So we're in a place where we are pretty comfortable with it. We will continue to test it many, many times before it gets anywhere. But we're at a place now where we're pretty comfortable with the way that it works. We wanted to get that down first so that we could finish the callings that rely on combat and finish the moves that rely on combat. Now we're working on, in a roundabout way, intrigue. But for that to work, you have to also know how the faction itself works. Because the intrigue schemes are going to be about improving your faction. So what we're doing at the moment is working on the faction itself, how you create it, how you improve it, how it works just generally, because it is sort of like another character, your faction. So your Game of Thrones house, your Longship crew, your Space Marine chapter, whatever.
That's neat. That's really cool. And so what has you inspired? What is the thing that you're like making notes on your phone about right now?
For me, one of the things is to answer that question, something that has us inspired that we're thinking about that might be a good fit is the what is it called? Like the stress and resistance system used in Spire and Heart.
Okay.
If you've heard of those RPGs, it's a really cool, again, sort of narrative first, but with enough of mechanical underpinning to kind of do what we are wanting to do with that. So we that's just on our little project plan for this next week.
Sure.
We're sort of doing things in terms of talking a little bit about the process. We caught up the other day and sort of scheduled out, because we started this project in November for a NaNoWriMo spin-off called Naga Demon, National Game Design Month. And that's where the goal there was to get as much of a first draft of a game from scratch as possible. And so that's where we got pretty much all the combat done and fleshed out outlined a lot of the rest of the game. And so now we've sat down and sort of plotted out over the next couple of months. We should be able to have it finished early next year. And we've got a weekly check-in, as well as usually at least one design session, which this morning we're using for this, which is awesome. So
that's cool. Yeah,
we're working on the faction at the moment, and we've created a system where you basically like roll some dice and figure out who your faction is, what their history is, how old they are, what they've been through, and that will determine your starting stats for your faction. So the stats in the game are steel, silver, spirit, and secrets.
Love it.
and your faction has the same. And so a high steel in your faction implies that your faction is like militarily strong, has good control over its domain, whatever that is, longship or massive lands or kingdom, whatever, and has like good defense just in general of itself, can protect itself. And then silver is money, obviously, wealth, both in assets and in liquid wealth. Spirit is like the morale of your faction, and it's like ties in with religious organizations. And then secrets is how much control you have over how other people see your faction, and your ability to like manipulate others with schemes and stuff like that. So that's like at a faction level what those things mean.
Yeah. That's and again, like talking about how, you know, so often when we design games, and I say we by me and many other designers that I've seen, when we go in, we take what exists and then we just use it. So we say, okay, my stat's going to be called something else, but it really is just strength. You just call it something else like power or whatever. And that usually is fine. But if you're going for a different feel entirely, like you just described how those things actually are not just one human. It's like those abilities you described sound bigger to me. They sound, your abilities or whatever, your facets, your tenets, whatever you want to call them. That also matters in terms of, you know, when you're designing a game, try to figure out what you want it to feel like and then put in the pieces. And this is what James and Jeff and I do a lot. And it takes way longer. But I want to give another tip. It's okay to, and you mentioned this, and I did the same thing, to start with a system that's finished and then change all of the things they did. Here's why. A finished system has accounted for all the things. Sometimes writing on a blank page and trying to figure it out, you'll give it to somebody and they'll say, hey, there's no way to move in your game. And so as silly as that sounds, like I started with Mecha Hack for Super Heroic. Now it is vastly different. And there's actually some workbenches on our Patreon we're going to be posting that are going to be us basically talking about, like James is like, what about this? And I'm like, nope, we can't change it yet. Like, let's just go down the line here. And it's a tough exercise, but at the end, you won't find a big hole in your game. So anyway, it's really cool to hear how that's those...
We're trying to work that way as well, like make a thing functional and then do the next thing and make it functional, as opposed to like make a thing and perfect it and have it, you know? So getting the combat functional makes some other things functional, and then making the faction work to a point where we're like, can test it. Like that's the important thing, because we want to, for me, I want to be running it as much as possible and trying it 150 times because you can look at a thing 150 million times on a piece of paper and see that all works. And then you try it and like you say, there's no way to move or something, you know, like that comes up with alarming regularity. So you just got to try it, get it down, get it to a point where it's like functional, and then do it.
Yep.
That's it. And there's, I think the terms are means testing, which is testing an element in isolation to make sure it itself works, so our combat system. And then there's integration testing, which is always keeping one eye on the bigger picture and all the other moving parts and seeing how well they integrate together, and making sure, like you say, that you don't have those big gaps where there's no way to move.
Right. Something else that we've learned in game design is that if you have to be okay with writing down a version of something, even if it's not what you're going to use, because you can't iterate a design off of a blank page. As basic as that sounds, like we're working on something right now with how we're going to do scenes and how the challenges work. I know that it's not what I want, but I started writing it down anyway, because then I can change it. In your head, it will become soup, and it will stay soup, and you'll just continue to roll, and nothing will ever get to the finish line. I would bet you that you're not going to finish your design in your head. Having to codify and quantify and write it out to explain it to another person will usually reveal, Lloyd, what you said, with alarming regularity. Oh, well, if X, then Y. Type. Oh, I should do it this way. Type. There's a time to think about game design in your head, and then there's a time to write it out, and you don't have to perfect it before you write it out. That's the biggest tip. Get it down, and it'll change. Look at the first version of Harbinger and Astra and all this stuff. It has changed so much. But if that didn't exist, we never would have done the first playtest. So
I'll add to that as well. Like, try using different tools and see what works for you. Because for me, I find writing in a physical book, just getting some of those things from my head down onto a physical book, I find myself more capable of doing that than straight into a document to sort of get the thoughts down and help finalize them. Not finalize them, but start that process of turning them from soup into
right, exactly,
into a first draft. Yeah. I just have a little book on my desk at my day job, and especially on my lunch break, I'll go and sit under a tree and do some design. But even just throughout the day as well, sometimes I'll pull out my phone, the notes in my phone. Sometimes if I have my book there, I'll just write those things down, and then get into the doc later, the Google Doc that we're designing this in, and add some comments in there, or just flick a quick message to Lloyd. And we do some of our game design just over messenger chat, like spitballing things. And then when we sit down for our next check-in, then we can sort of consolidate those ideas a bit better and see how they fit in.
I think it's really important as well to write, because I often just write gets to do a cool thing with money as an ability, right? Like, you don't have to know exactly what it is. You just have to know what the intent is when you're designing initially. So I often write when we were designing the classes, it was like, is really tough, does more damage, whatever. Like, those are fine to start with. You just need to give like a brief, and it's good to get it out of your brain and onto the page, I think, as much as possible. And we still have a lot of that in there where it's just like, does some cool stuff related to wealth or secrets or something. And that's enough to give you the sort of like mileposts for you to follow to actually finish making the thing. But I think initially it's really good to just put something down there that gives the impression of what you want in the end,
Yes, that's exactly right.
The square brackets idea, the technique that you guys outlined here, I think that was in one of your workbenches, wasn't it, Tim? That's been a big help for me, because I am very much, Lloyd and I were talking about this the other day, I really have to try and focus, I'm still working on it, to not edit my writing as I write. And I don't quite get in that flow mind state. I have done a few times where I'm just writing, knowing that I'm going to come back and edit it later. And it's an awesome feeling. So I'm trying to get there more. But that's something that Lloyd is really good at.
Well, I have
getting
the other
it down
issue
and then,
in that I don't edit at all. I have the issue of just like throwing whatever nonsense down, but it's down at least, which is helpful in its own way.
Yeah, and the bracket method is exactly what you described, Kiel. So many people will stop because they're like, I want this faction to have a cool name, and it derails their entire momentum. They're working. Oh, just put a left bracket, which is it's to the right of your P key on your keyboard. Left bracket, and write in cool faction name. Right bracket, highlight it yellow, and then keep going. Because when you're going to come up with that cool faction name is not often in that moment anyway. Even if you spent 20 minutes on Wikipedia and all this, you will find one that you think is good because you kind of just want to move on, and then you plug it in, and then 3 days later, you're in the shower and you go, oh, Decimus, that's it. And then that's how you want to do it. Then you go in and you fill in that bracket. You have to figure out when to do what and maximize on your time, because you know what I can't do all the time is be in a doc. But I can constantly be brainstorming of cool ideas and cool factions and stuff like that.
I also have different kinds of flow. So sometimes I can really write prose a lot. I can write the fluff that goes in to explain how to do a thing or the lore of a thing. But sometimes I cannot do that. no matter how hard I try, but I can write mechanics.
Right.
Those are totally different tasks to me.
They are.
Like I have a much easier time writing rules than I have writing the how to use the game or how to play the game or what the world is. Like that's way harder for me. But it'll depend. And so if I find that I'm struggling to do one, I'll be like, okay, well, I can't do this at the moment, so I'll do the other one, you know, or I'll do layout, or I'll do formatting, or whatever, 100 things, you know.
Yeah. There's always something to do.
Yes, exactly.
Turn some stock art into a silhouette for a character sheet. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, and so the other thing to consider is that if you are stuck on that thing, because exactly what you're saying, Lloyd, you can jump to a totally other thing. Sometimes when you're brand new at a project or the project is too new, you don't have another thing to jump into. You can jump into another part of that project that you're excited about, and it will still be work. So at Tabletop Terrors, we have a phrase called eating your vegetables. Eating your vegetables is doing the thing you don't want to do because it needs to get done. And that's just how you have to do it sometimes. You have to eat your vegetables. Eating your vegetables is sometimes like, I'm just done. I've had enough spinach. I want some cake. Go to the thing that you're inspired by that is just not due. And you're still going to get work done on like, oh, this and oh, that. Oh, yeah, I'm going to make this cool faction. I'm going to design the logo for the Quill class. Because you just feel like doing that. That is a self-help thing that will keep you motivated rather than just continuing to eat your vegetables and then you feel demotivated, and most people will then pull the ripcord and bail and go binge watch something on Netflix. So it's a tricky balance.
Right. Like you can do the work doing the work that you're interested in is still doing work in the project. And so maybe you don't have to do it right now, but it's better than not doing anything is to work on something.
Yes.
So if there's something that you can work on and that you feel enthused about, then do that. If you can't make yourself do the other thing, you'll get there eventually.
Yeah, 100%. So we have a lot of great people in the chat. Thank you for hanging out with us. We are talking about Blood and Ink. We've had some people ask, where are these Patreons? I did put the link into the chat. When the video is done, I will put them in the description. I didn't think to do that because we were kind of making it on the fly. So I'm going to hit, if it's cool with you two, I was going to hit some comments real quick in the chat. Just kind of touch on that a little bit.
Let's do it.
All right, cool. I know we're at about 50 minutes. We have about 10 minutes left for the stream, roughly. So if you have any questions and you're watching this live, throw them into the chat. It can be about Blood and Ink. It can be about game design. It can be about whatever that is related to that stuff. Josie Adams says, progress is so deeply motivating. It is. We have a term we also use. You'll find we have a lot of terms. Sometimes you don't love writing. You love having written.
Yeah, that's a big one.
That's huge. And I just want to say, really, the number of times I sit down in my chair, you know what? I'll actually just dish right now, straight up. I absolutely wanted to work on Super Heroic. I wanted to work on that, but I knew that if I didn't work on my little Wintertide game now, it wouldn't get done before Christmas, and then I would never do it. I could lie to myself and say I'd do it next Christmas, but we all know it wouldn't happen. And I'm not going to do it in the middle of February. So I sat down, and I was not inspired until I started doing it. And then I realized, oh, no, I am inspired to do this. So anyway, yes.
Yep. I find sometimes even just opening the program, so this is more about graphic design or layout, but even just opening the program, making yourself do that, and that's enough sometimes to get me started doing the thing. So sometimes I'm sitting here and I'm like, oh, I could just watch YouTube and play a video game. And then I open up Photoshop or InDesign. I'm like, well, I'm here now already, so I might as well do a little bit. And then I'm an hour in and I'm working.
Yeah.
And then I'm really glad I did that. Sometimes it's the hardest part is to click the program or like to open the dock or something, But once you started, it's usually like easier. You've pushed it over the hill, sort of.
Yeah, that's great. I have a question that I'm going to throw. If you're comfortable with it, Kiel, if you feel like you're like, nah, someone else should answer this. We have a question from Josie. She says, Josie says, I get most of my ideas in the middle of other projects. How do I avoid falling into the shiny idea traps? Now, I have an answer that I will follow up with, but do you have anything that you've done in this zone, or is this something you're still working through?
So yeah, the shiny idea trap is a is a tricky one to avoid. But as some of you might know, I do have a lot of projects on the go at the moment. And I'm the same, Josie. I get lots of ideas in the middle of other projects. So I suppose one of the things that I have, I'm not sure, my little whiteboard. We rearranged the office recently. So my little project whiteboard where I have what's on the front burner, what's on the back burner, what's on the sideline, and what's on the horizon. That's something that I've sketched out on a little whiteboard, which just really helps me visualize and helps me when I get a cool idea about a different project, whether it's a new one, I just add it to on the horizon. If it's like, that's awesome, I'll do that later. And maybe pop open the notes app on my phone or my book and just jot down the idea I do have, because you don't want to lose that stuff. And for me, my memory is pretty shocking. So I just will give myself that permission to just quickly put down some notes and add it to on the horizon to then it just does something in my mind where I know that it's not going to be lost. It's not going to be forgotten. It might be 5, 10 years or never when I pick it up, but at least that thing that I was energized by and inspired by, that's down and that's now on the list, it's in the pipeline somewhere, even if it's down the track. So, or if the idea that I get is for one of my other projects that is on the back burner, while I'm in the middle of working on Blood and Ink, which is one of the front burner projects, I'll do the same thing, like giving yourself permission to embrace that energy and that inspiration can feed back into the project that you are meant to be working on, because you're then energized about that idea and you have that trust and that faith that you're going to get back to it later. For me, that's a massive thing, because otherwise you get something that's always resonated with me since I first heard you say it, Tim, was that unused creativity is not benign. And to me, that's really resonated. And I feel very fortunate that I'm in a place now where I have carved out this place and this routine for myself where I have these projects on the go, and I've made a sort of, a life for myself where I can pursue different projects and have them on the go, and I can see the progress that I'm making. And I've even released some little things, and it's all a very exciting time for me. Whereas a few years ago, I had that same energy and all these ideas, but I didn't have the right place to channel them, or I didn't have the time because I hadn't carved out the right sort of time slots or figured out the routine and the schedule with other things in my life. And so, and that I struggled back then. So yeah, over the last couple of years, I'm in a much better place now. So in terms of answering the question, embrace it, chase that idea, that energy, that inspiration, get it down, and try and come up with a little system where you can do that, and then knowing that you can get back to the project that you are meant to be focusing on.
Yeah. Is there anything you want to throw out about that, Lloyd? Or
I would just say, try and prioritize. I think it's also great to, if something strikes you as an idea. My biggest issue as a GM is that I watch a piece of media and I think I want to run a campaign that's about samurai because I watched 13 Warriors or something, right?
Yeah.
And I am so into that for exactly 4 days, right? It dominates my life and I'm so into it, but then it vanishes again. And so I've had to learn to avoid going all in those things, because actually the long-term things that I'm into, I'm always into. And these things that appear, what I do now is I make an interest post and I don't post it, or I, something like that, because I know that it's just a current flame where I'm oh, this is so cool. But actually in practice, if I wait a week, it's still cool, but it's not so cool that I want to dedicate several hours a month to it necessarily,
That's great.
Or
that's
even
really
if you're
great.
running the game. So make sure that it's a real interest that's going to stick with you before you invest too much time in it, and prioritize the things that you know that you want to finish and that are really important to you.
That's really good. The other thing that I'll say to that, Josie, and this is something that I have learned about myself, so your mileage may vary, but the reason why it's easy to get inspired by something else is because there's this really fun little dawn of a project where there's no hard work involved. And it's all about the, dreamy-eyed ideas of how cool this thing could be. And the moment that you have to start to distill it down into a specific idea and then write it out, it gets way harder and less fun because you have to make infinite number of decisions. And I find that if we're being honest, most people have that next shiny idea right when it gets time to clean up from the last party.
Yeah.
So
yep.
That is something, if you just identify and say, okay, I know I have to do a lot of work on this thing. So I'm, like they said, but identifying why you have this shiny new idea, it's not just because all of a sudden this idea struck you. It's because you probably don't want to sit down and do the hard work. And that's not a slam on you. That's everybody. Because it's way more fun to just come up with the new thing.
Right. We often talk about new campaign smell in that same vein, which is like when you start a campaign, it's the most exciting part of the campaign sometimes, like, oh shit, sick, new idea. And then we get to like put out a session 0 doc and we're all working on it and everyone's super hyped and everyone's posting art. And then you have to run session 3 and you're like, oh, this is work.
Exactly. Now I have to run these threads together. So I highly recommend doing what these gentlemen suggested.
You what?
Yeah, exactly. Which is give yourself permission. And I don't want to drag this question out too long, but the other thing that solves this entirely is a consistent work schedule. There's no problem spending 30 minutes or an hour on something when you've spent 4 other hours that week on the project you're supposed to be working on. So it's when...
Or, you've got those 4 hours scheduled.
Yes,
Sorry
correct.
to cut you off, but that's what's helped for me.
Exactly. If you work sporadically, you feel guilty and it's destructive mentally. So, I think we have time for another couple more. My dinner just arrived, but nice. I'm cool with a little longer. There's a lot of really good stuff in the chat. I know that there were some questions. There was one specifically. Spaced on Incorporated Gaming Clan Archive said, how much should you spend creating a game? Do you mean time or money? That's really important. You can spend 0 money creating a game. And conversely, you can spend infinite time. So it's free, but it costs you your time. I've heard a lot about Trello. Trello works really well if you know how to use it. I highly, highly, highly recommend Wrike, Wrike. It's got this really cool visualization tool. You can put tasks in. You can assign it to others. It's free for certain use. Wrike is like a task board. It's really... I highly recommend that. Let's see if there are any other. I think it's a getting things done concept, writing stuff down to get it out of your head. I vaguely recall that from one of the attempts to corral my life. Do you gents see any questions that I missed, like specific questions?
Just having to scroll through now. Trying to catch
Same.
There is one. What are your top 3 things for getting ideas? Not counting slamming your face on the keyboard for inspiration.
Oh, that was top 1 and 2.
Yeah. For me, it's like consuming media in any form. So I mean, it comes to me the most unexpected places sometimes, like music, like listening to music often inspires me to run games, watching TV, movies, like playing video games, painting miniatures, like all that stuff. And even just like being outside, I mean, less so nowadays, but traditionally being outside and like seeing a thing on the street or something, like all of that can make a big difference and inspire you with some ideas. So just be open to like seeing something or listening to something that you wouldn't expect and having that be a game idea. Like the game ideas don't have to come from books about games. They can come from literally anywhere. So I think like, if you open your mind to the idea that like a song can inspire a game, or that the dinner you cooked or the way that you cooked it or the way that it went wrong can inspire a scene in an RPG, like all that stuff, like inspiration's all over the place in places that you wouldn't expect. And I think it can be tricky to like accept that, because I think a lot of people are like, okay, well, if it's in a D&D book, then it inspires my D&D game. But actually, like, maybe that's the worst place to get inspiration for D&D games.
I agree with that. I agree with that. Kiel, what about you? Where do you get your ideas? I know that's the number one question that most writers get asked.
Yeah, similar. I I try and get them from anywhere that I can. My mind, like this was in the post that you put in the AbTab group recently, Tim, about, well, it sparked this response from me and this sort of realization of a way that my mind has always sort of worked. Like whenever I watch a documentary, whenever I'm going for a walk in the bush, whenever I see a particularly interesting person, you know, on the street, all of that stuff, I just can't help. It's just my mind naturally puts that, like brings that in and churns it around through the lens and through the little washing machine and the soup pot, right? Of how can I use that? Like, where would that fit into any of my worlds that I'm making, games I'm designing, one shots that I'm planning to run, characters that I'm, you know, trying to come up with, relationships, motivations, all of that stuff. That's just, I'm not sure if everyone's mind works that way, but that's something that I just can't really switch off. It's always sort of every piece of stimulus my brain receives, it's sort of giving it that treatment. So, which I've, I guess from a lifetime of that happening, especially in recent years, found a way to sort of work that to my favor.
Yeah, I do think you can like cultivate that as a discipline though, as opposed to just having it happen to you, like encouraging it to happen. So like actively thinking about games in general, I guess, but specifically like design and running games, like when you're doing things that are not related to that, that's been huge for me. Like I said, cooking a meal can be a huge like if you mess up your dinner, that's such a disappointment, and that's a real feeling that you can put into a game like Iskoft, where a meal's a really big deal, and if you mess that up, like that's a scene. That's a whole scene for role play or whatever, you know.
Disrespect to a jarl because you served her or him something like that was not fitting a jarl, and
or you're like struggling on supplies and you only have this one chance, and then you burn it. Like, oh great, now we have no food. Right? Like, plenty of things like that could go wrong, and that inspiration can be anywhere.
Yeah, no, that's great. And so I'm going to give you the thing that is, again, like the more I design games and go through these awful things that I have actual mental anguish about, the more I like start to find patterns and identify not just the how, but the why and the things that sort of feed into it. And for me, this is a really big one. The best time to have the great idea is not when you need it. You will have a hard time finding an idea if you stop and go, all right. So what I call it is the idea net, and it's this thing that Lloyd is talking about and Kiel is talking about, and as you cultivate it and as you get very skilled at doing this, I have this, for lack of a better way, think of it as a closet, like a storeroom of really cool ideas. So when I'm watching that superhero movie or that rewatch of Lord of the Rings at Thanksgiving and something pops into my head, I make sure to put it in that dock. And then when I need a good idea, I go shopping. Not, I got to stop and think of an idea. You will be beating your face against the keyboard when you're like, I need a faction, I need a faction, I need a faction. Right. If you already have a dock and you're like, let me go faction shopping, your life gets real easy. Couple more quick questions. One of them was, and I think we'll probably end on this because this is a really good one. How do you know when a game is done? And I'll give a quick answer to this. A game is never done. You just decide when to stop working on it. What do you guys think?
I was basically going to say that. Yeah. I mean, if anyone on this earth is guilty of this, it's me with my game. That is extremely late because I keep messing with it and keep changing it and keep thinking that that I can fix it. I mean, it's fine and it works, and it should have been done a long time ago. So I think like that's something that I fell into, and it's easy to fall into, is the idea that like there is some state that you can bring your game into where it is complete. And I don't think that's a state that exists actually, because you'll always, no matter how many times you go over it, find a new thing that you can improve or change or tweak or whatever, you know? So I think you just decide it's done is when it's finished.
Yeah. And of course it has to be playable.
Absolutely.
Like, in other words, I'll say this real quick. You can have a not finished game that you play, and that's okay. So many people think that they have to finish a game before they play it, and it's actually a very bad practice, because you will find those things that Lloyd talked about where these two things don't mesh, but you spend a lot of time on both separately. if you watch an artist draw something, a trained artist most of the time, they'll often sketch out the shape and then fill in and then fill in and slowly work up to details. So that's something to consider. You should have a sketch of your game first and then try it before you start detailing it. It's very rare you see an awesome, amazing drawing where the head was done in full detail, followed by the neck, followed by the shoulders. It's difficult to have the shape of it, to the proportions to be correct. So you want to outline your game, you want to sketch it, you want to then fill in the details, and the time will come where you fill in those shadows for the nose and the eye and all that. But the first playtest should happen when you have that first figure. Hey, let's try this. Ooh, that feels wrong. That's weird. Change this. And you slowly do that.
I always think of it like making a machine. Like you have to make sure that it works each time you add a new bit, you know, like you have to make sure that the robot can walk. And then when you add a new bit to it, you have to make sure it doesn't like knock it over when it walks. And like, you have to keep testing it to make sure that it's working, right? Like you can't just make it to completion then and be like, oh, it doesn't work, falls over actually because there's too much stuff on that, you know, like I'm like stretching this metaphor a bit, but like really you need to be trying it over and over again and keep pushing to try it even when it's not ready. Try it way before it's ready. That's what we did with this game. Like you should try it the second that you're capable of running 20 minutes of it, you should run 20 minutes of it, and then you should run 40 minutes, and then you should keep going and keep trying it.
Yeah. You might be familiar with this, Tim. James might have spoken about it. There's a mantra or like a philosophy or whatever in modern software design, software development. I have one of my best friends is a software developer, and in modern, it's called agile software development, is release early, release often. And it's basically that, in essence, it's that. So you don't have to release your thing to the whole world or to, you know, the public. You just release it to a group of playtesters or whatever. So that's what we've been trying to do with this. Like we've now got our sort of weekly milestones that we're setting for ourselves from a project perspective, and we've sort of decided to some extent ahead of time when it's going to be done. Because that's what you were saying before. It's when you decide it's done is when it's finished. So you can decide the trajectory a little bit of when that is. And then as you get closer to that expected time that it's done, you sort of are checking in to see, all right, are we on track there? But all along the way is where we're releasing, every week or two, where we'll do a play test, release it to a small group, and not only to see how it works, but to get people's feedback is a very important part of that process. For me, it's getting other people's eyes on it, you know.
That also
seeing how it actually works in practice,
that motivates you. Seeing people use your stuff is just like, oh yay, you know, like that's the coolest thing in the world. Yep. It's wonderful. So I lied. I'll do one final question because Cole is she is actually a patron, so I feel not only is she an awesome person, but I feel compelled to answer her question specifically. The question is yours just one big doc, Tim? Doesn't it get too huge to be useful? It absolutely does. But it doesn't when it's blank. So I now have a folder of ideas because I work often enough that I'm constantly emptying out the shelf. So the answer to that is, this is what worked for me. Mileage may vary. You start with a doc. And Google Docs has a bookmarking feature in a table of contents. Make it a heading. So make the heading cool mage, and then write whatever you have under it. Make the next heading, awesome faction. And then when you can go into Google Docs and you can generate a table of contents. And when you open up that doc, it's a bunch of blue links to words. And you go, ooh, so you just scroll the table of contents. Once that gets big enough to where you're like, oh, I'm going to make a superhero game. Now I have a superheroic doc. And only that lives there, et cetera, et cetera. So you build it out as it is necessary. But a lot of us geeks, especially if we're into, organization and all this stuff, we'll spend a whole hour of like, all right, I'm going to build my folders. And you're really just, you're wasting time. You're not doing any work. You're just making this framework that isn't going to work for you. So that's how I do it. Start with one doc, do a table of contents, and move it into other docs as is necessary. And then eventually into folders. And then before you know it, you'll know that really well. Anything else you guys want to say on that real quick?
Same thing for me. I start with the doc, and then when it gets too big to be useful, I take sections of the doc and make them their own docs. So with this one, we started with the full thing, and then we have one doc for factions, one for callings, one for origins, whatever, all these different parts of the game in their own doc. So it's easier to get in there and quickly find out what you want, but start with one doc and then keep at it until it's too big to be easily scrolled through.
Yeah, and Xavier Granville also says the document outline feature is also great if you don't want to generate a TOC. That's great too. One thing I will warn you of, do not just have your notes on your phone, because inevitably it's going to get lost, broken, stolen, and you don't want that to add this extra layer of just devastating pain. Early and often, like Kiel said, make sure you back up your stuff, put it into the docs so it's in the cloud, because then you can access it anywhere. So, yes, well, thank you all. This has been really, really great. Thank you, Kiel and Lloyd. Again, Run Right Play on Patreon. Check out Kiel. It's all about world building, and it is definitely worth it. And Kiel and Lloyd are just magical people. They're very kind. And so let's end it. I don't know if you gents have a drink handy, but I have my big old cartoonishly big glass of water here. But I'm going to do a Tabtarian toast. May you mend the first break. May you kill the first snake, and may you conquer everything you undertake.
Sláinte.
Sláinte. All right, everybody. Have a fantastic day and evening, and we'll do this again soon. Talk to you later.
Bye.